This lecture will be given by Professor George Acker. And he's from Bowling Green State University, but currently he's the visiting professor at National Taiwan University. And he's been working on the area of philosophy of sciences and also medical humanities. And today we'll be talking about scientific integrity and the practice of science.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. Not only am I a philosopher, but I spent my career, actually, most of my career, as a medical school faculty member, and at least in several institutions, I was one of the people responsible for designing and largely delivering programs on responsible conduct of research. I start with this cartoon that's at the front of my title slide, because that monster, that organism that's coming into the lab, that's being beaten back by the either the lab technician or the scientist, that organism represents the sort of thing that we do as educators focusing on responsible conduct of research. And I want to take a critical look at what we do. Dr. Wang Wang said that he apologized because he didn't want to give offense to ethicists here. I certainly agree with much of what he had to say. But I am somebody as a philosopher who thinks that sometimes maybe we should give offense. And so I'm looking not to give offense to physicians and scientists, but to try to get us who are doing responsible conduct of research to think more critically about what we're doing and how we're doing it. I should also mention that I'm actually sympathetic towards that female researcher, because she's not using a laboratory flask, but it looks like maybe I imagine it's a bottle of good scotch or wine. She's beating back. Okay, now to be serious. I often hear researchers say, if there's no law or policy against a particular behavior, then is the behavior okay? Can we be punished for a behavior that's not illegal? And one reply is to say, do you need a law to tell you what's ethically inappropriate? And certainly, as ethicists, we would want to say lack of a law or regulation doesn't give you the permission to behave inappropriately or wrongly. But I think we ought to think and ask ourselves, what generates this kind of question? And in the area of scientific research, often one of the elements that generates this kind of question from scientists is in fact the kind of educational programs that we develop in responsible conduct of research. And I say that as someone who's developed these programs, and so this is really a self-criticism. There is an area, however, I should mention where law and regulation is very helpful, and it's been already mentioned, but I want to use this very distinguished philosopher, the cartoon Dilbert. I don't know if you know it in Taiwan. It's a character who is some of you know it. He actually works in a cubicle in a large corporation. He's a good sociological comment. And so the coworker comes and says, remember to include my name on a patent application. It could be just like Dr. DeCastro mentioned, include me as an author. I gave you the tissue. And Dilbert says, why you didn't help? That's ridiculous. I've been helping you to design that thing for months. And Dilbert says, of course, I saved 3 of your emails, all 3 of them. Allow me to read them. Dude, is something wrong with your brain? That's a contribution. Later, hey Dilweed, maybe you should replace the backplane with a gizmo. Totally meaningless advice. Then my favorite, Dillbag, I'm glad you took my advice to leave the black plane alone. And he says, that's my way of helping. And I love Dilbert, the response. It's great. You should patent that way of helping. Okay. the point is that in areas like publication and issues of patenting, there are rules. We need to pay attention to the standards that the international medical and scientific editors have come up with. And we need to pay attention to that. And I'm not discounting that. So I'm not being critical of the teaching that focuses on the rules for the avoidance of misconduct. What I want you to realize with me is that so much of our teaching focuses on that we omit and understress another important aspect of how scientific integrity is learned, developed, and nurtured within scientific education. It goes back partly to what Dr. Wang said, to the development of character, but I believe that character in science is just not a good person. The good scientist is good not because he or she has the character of a moral human being, but because they have the discipline of science that goes along with that good character. And I would insist, maybe in distinction to Dr. Wang, that it's not just development of character, it's to develop a character with that sense of methodology and discipline that's a rigorous demand, and I don't think you would disagree, even though you didn't stress that. This is actually a slide. It's just meant, and I've got a couple of these. These are illustrations. This is an illustration of a slide from a colleague of mine who actually took over some of the teaching in a major medical center where I was at on responsible conduct of research, and she put together one of the best lectures on responsible conduct of research that I'd ever heard. And this is actually a slide she actually used. And so she was focusing on not just the regulations, but things that I think we should pay attention to, like appropriate laboratory practice. So this is her slide. What is it? Appropriate laboratory practice. So what does she say? Following a written protocol. Thorough and legible data documentation, including, and then she lists some examples, that you list the reagent, lot number, expiration date, and so on, so that everyone knows that your experiment was done with standardized and active and appropriate material. Appropriately storing data and specimens, appropriately storing reagents and chemicals, proper equipment maintenance and calibration, and use of standard operating procedures. Well, I was in the back of the audience, a very large hall like this, when she presented this slide, and I thought, wonderful, boy, she's covered things that I hadn't even ever covered before. And one of the young students put his hand up and said, could you elaborate on the last 4 points? What are appropriate storing data specimens? How do you appropriately store reagents? What's proper equipment maintenance, and so on and so on? And of course she says, well, that's not my area. I'm an ethicist. I mean, your mentor and this laboratory scientist, the director, will teach you that. And he put up his hand, he persisted and says, yeah, but that's what I think I need to know, and I'm here, but you're not teaching me that. And other students began to say, yeah, you're not teaching that. Well, I tried to bail her out, since she worked for me, from the back, and I put my hand up. She recognized me, and I said, how many in the audience share that concern? And almost every hand went up among the scientists and residents. And it just taught me a very profound lesson that, in fact, people like my colleague and I have no business, because we don't know what appropriate storing of reagents are. Don't ask me. And so we need partnership with scientists, and that needs to be done collaboratively as we design programs. So that's part of what I'm trying to suggest. Now let me go back to what motivates my concern and why I used that cartoon where that terrible organism is threatening the laboratory, that organism being educators doing scientific integrity, okay? This is from the U.S. federal definition of scientific misconduct. And I believe it's not very different from the language that you have. Research misconduct defined as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting research results. Okay. And let me just use this slide. This is from Margaret Dale, who was Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs at Harvard, and she gave this at at a national workshop on at the Scientific Research Society in 2000. She says, one thing institutions learn is that their reputation is much better protected from being very rigorous about these, namely misconduct cases, okay? Rather than trying to cover them up or trying to push them down. Taking these cases seriously becomes a reputation protecting strategy of the institution. I've been part of that attitude. And I have to say that for the scientist and the young student, that attitude when you're in the laboratory looks like there is this foreign organism outside threatening you because your institution will not back you is the worry if there's threats of misconduct. I think that worry is misfounded because there's protections for scientists, but nonetheless, part of the problem is that we focus on misconduct when we talk about scientific integrity. We teach what misconduct is. One student put up his hand in a class I was teaching and said, wow, those are all things that I hadn't thought that I might do. I was educated, I could tell you. I don't know how much you know about Roman Catholicism, but I was educated as a child in a parochial, a Roman Catholic school. And they had a list of movies that at that time the Vatican said were not appropriate to see. Leo, who knows what I'm talking about, is laughing. Was your experience, Leo, as mine? That's the list you went to see what you should try to get to? If you couldn't do it, it was interesting. There's a paradox here, and I think we need to face up and ask this hard question. This slide is actually from Chris Pascal, who's director of the Office of Research Integrity in Washington, and he claimed to an institution I was at, we did a joint conference together, and he used this slide, and I just want to point out, he has this research integrity continuum, FFP, and he points out at the bottom, it's fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, and other institutional misconduct, all the way going to responsible research practices. Well, I point this slide out to you, and I pointed this out to Chris, and I have in conversations since. All he had to say, and quite frankly, all most of us had to say, was on the left side of that slide. We talked only about misconduct, but we didn't talk about what are the positive, responsible research practices. And it seems to me that that's a serious, serious problem. And so we need to ask ourselves, as people who are committed to developing programs in teaching scientists and developing scientists, to have a sense of responsibility and to conduct their research with integrity and with honesty, that we not simply tell them that there are problems they should avoid, but rather should give them the tools to understand what's essential. Well, how do we think about that? I'm going to give you a couple of quick examples. Again, this is from an institution I just made up. I pulled this from a lot of policies, but I called it Standard University. And this is what goes in university documents, at least in the United States, and they're probably familiar to you in Taiwan as well. This is a list, again, of all the things that you should not do, okay? And it says, other practices that seriously deviate from ethical standards that are commonly accepted within the scientific and scholarly communities. That is what we don't focus on. What are those ethical standards in the scientific community? And I think we need to do a better job of focusing on that. I'm going to not comment on that. And so the question I'm trying to pose to you is, when we think about developing programs in scientific integrity and in nurturing our students and researchers to engage in the conduct of science, both from the inception, the actual research process, and then publication, should we focus only on misconduct, or should we focus on developing more positively a sense of integrity? I think misconduct is important because such behaviors violate the values that guide scientific research as a practice. The problem is that we don't do a terribly good job, and I say we, not just people like me, philosophers, bioethicists, but scientists aren't doing a very good job in the laboratory in science courses in helping students understand that science itself has a unique integrity. It's based not on the avoidance of violating external rules, but rather on a deep set of values that have evolved historically and are still not universally accepted. Let me give you a couple of examples. In the United States, there's a debate. Should we teach evolution in the schools or should we teach creationism? I mean, you think science is accepted in the United States? Of course it is. But that's a major, major debate. Some school districts don't want to teach evolution because it violates religious beliefs. There are debates over genetically modified organisms in Europe, the use of them in foodstuffs. You look at those debates carefully, and it focuses on rhetorical notions, largely not understanding what the underlying science is with respect to the modification of the foodstuffs and so on. And you have similar worries about stem cell research. I want to caution you to realize that while you in Taiwan enjoy the national support for research and science, it's the case that society has not always been that supportive. And you may have to go back 100 years or so, but that's a short time historically. And there's a time when physicians could not do autopsies. That's not so long ago. We take that for granted. Social attitudes permit that. My argument is to say that we need a better conversation about the peculiar values of science to help scientists, students of science, to understand more importantly, deeply, what scientific integrity involves as they engage in science. And I think ideally scientific integrity should be part of the basic curriculum for students in the basic and medical sciences. And it shouldn't be something that I, as a bioethicist, am brought out on the stage to do 1 hour, 1 semester, or whatever. I mean, it needs to be something that's embedded in the actual learning of scientists as they engage in their research. It has to be learned effectively. Scientific integrity must be a deliberate and intentional feature of scientific teaching, especially for scientists. And I think that's one of the problems we have. Mentors will push young researchers, will push laboratory assistants to get results without sort of supervising and paying attention to how scrupulously important it is to actually get results that are accurate, that have adequate record keeping, and so on. And it's no wonder then that reputable scientists get in problems because of scientific misconduct, because laboratory records, not records that they keep, but that assistants keep, are not accurate. Those are problems that occur elsewhere. So I would argue that if we're going to teach scientific integrity, that students need to be required to learn the basic prerequisites not only for scientific research, they need to understand what's an experimental hypothesis. I mean, why is that so different from what we do in other areas of science? I mean, usually we try to persuade somebody for our views. We don't rush out and do an experiment. Scientists rush out and do an experiment. They have a wonderful idea, but they subject it to empirical data. That is something that's unique in science, and I think we need to help scientists and students understand more centrally what those demands are in doing scientific research. Students are not helped to understand why they do what they do. I've asked students in basic science courses about record keeping, and they said to me, oh yeah, that's the sort of thing that the teaching assistant does in my course, and they just give me bad grades if I don't have good records. But they don't understand the importance of good record keeping. For them, it's just another useless academic exercise that they do. And they'd be happy to be through that course so they don't have to worry about that, because no one will check their lab journals when they're more senior in their studies. That's a serious problem. Very serious problem in my judgment. And we have to recognize, as others have pointed out, that scientific research is, unfortunately, a competitive practice with enormous social and psychological pressures regarding funding, publication, and academic advancement and promotion. And I think we need to help our students understand that knowing how to do competent research does not seem sufficient in the face of enormous pressures and incentives to cut corners or cheat. That's where students can be helped to understand why we have these external regulations. They're there not to constrain you, not to invade your life as a scientist, as my first slide showed, but they're there in order to provide order, just like traffic laws. I sit there and I say, the light's red and I wish I could go, but I realize that that's there in order not to impede my progress across town, but it's there in order to provide for public safety in using the highways. So I think responsible researchers understand that the regulation of scientific misconduct involves socially necessary external mechanisms of oversight that, however, rely on more important internal values that make up the integrity of science. And it's these internal values that we have to help our scientist colleagues to develop and to nurture and to teach in a very self-conscious way in our students. Skepticism about science, knowledge claims until proven, the notion of scientific truth as opposed to dogmatic truth, commitment to empirical methods, openness to new ideas in the pursuit of knowledge. These are ideals that are peculiar to science, and they're not specialized anywhere else in society. And we need to understand how those are operationalized in the particular disciplines that our students are studying. So I think if we're going to truly design effective programs for teaching scientific integrity, we have to understand it as something by first in the historical context of understanding how sciences have developed, especially how the research attitude emerged over against dogmatic cultural, political, or religious beliefs. We take that for granted in the 21st century, but that is something that is historically a very, very recent phenomenon, just in the early modern period. And we need to recognize that in some societies, on some issues, we're in a precarious balance because there are social forces who would like to close down avenues of research precisely because they believe that scientific knowledge and scientific truth needs to be pushed aside and replaced with dogmatic or political truth. You don't have to go very far to find these examples. Soviet Russia has a history of using psychiatric and genetic research to serve political purposes. And it's not just Soviet Russia as well. I mentioned these problems in the United States with attitudes about we can't teach evolution in the schools. These are problems that we must recognize, and I think if we recognize them, it should give scientists an incentive to be much more conscious and intentful in inculcating the values and the central idea of what drives science to their students. When you have that built into students, the understanding of the external rules becomes less burdensome and much more understandable and defensible. And so finally, I want to say that knowing why research standards, not just misconduct standards, but general research standards, exist helps researchers understand the deep meaning of their practice as researchers. And I think good researchers do that and are aware of that, but I think it's important that in leading students through their development in scientific knowledge, that there's more attention to that. My solution is to bring in senior researchers in and to talk to them about how they do this and how they might do this in the laboratory, not just to say, oh, release your graduate students or your students to me for 3 hours next week so I could give lectures on misconduct. Okay? I think we need much more collaboration. And so seen in this light, misconduct and science rules are like traffic rules, something to be observed, but not something to tell us what kind of journey we're on, nor what should be our destination. Thank you.